It's November 22nd, 2024 when we're recording this. In the embassy of the Russian Federation, I'm talking to His Excellency Mr. Vladimir Tarabrin.
Yeah.
Thank you for your hospitality, allowing me to set up my mobile studio in your embassy. First time for me in an embassy ever. I want to talk to you in a frank, open conversation about the situation in the world. And I invited you to an interview. The interview I propose would focus on your views on international geopolitical developments and Russian foreign policies. Yeah, to be honest, I don't get to see much of the Russian standpoint on the Dutch television. So I figured, well, let's talk to them, see if you accept the invitation.
Yeah.
And you did. Through the interview, I would try to gain an understanding of Russia's observations of what is going on and of Russia's objectives with BRICS and with Ukraine, for instance. Also, I'm trying to gain an understanding of the US and the NATO objectives and the Dutch objectives. The world doesn't make sense anymore for me. I'm 53. I've been doing this journalism since 2018. Things have changed. Preparing for this conversation, I saw something that was recorded in this very room 2 years ago. And I saw the statue. Maybe we can start there. Who is looking over your shoulder there?
Oh, it's Peter the Great. It's Peter the Great, Russian Tsar, Russian Emperor, who was, in fact, a big admirer of the Dutch style of life. He visited the Netherlands just in a big delegation, as we can call it. At that time, it was called embassy, you know. Yeah. But that was a delegation that he participated not in his official capacity, but as a member of the delegation. And he stayed in the Netherlands, I think, for about 2 years or maybe a bit less. And he gained a lot of experience, you know, that he brought back to Russia in his efforts to modernize the society, the way of life, the economy, the army, etc., etc., etc. So he was a big fan of if we can use the modern sports term, of the Netherlands, you know, and he really gained a lot of experience.
You've been ambassador for a little less than a year. What's your first impressions of this country?
Oh, you know, really, I like this country, the Netherlands. I think the people are friendly. The lifestyle is also very attractive. I like people using bicycles instead of cars. You know, it's a good method to save the environment. You know, and that's why for me it's a pleasure to be here. But you know, frankly speaking, I am certainly disappointed at the same time with the way the Dutch officials and the Dutch media, mainstream media, portray Russia. It's very hostile, I would say, very hostile approach. We are accused of all kinds of sins everywhere, you know. There is always a kind of a concept, Russians ate my homework, you know, that is used to explain all kind of incident everywhere. And we constantly read about some subversive actions, action of sabotage, espionage, etc., 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 that have nothing to do with reality, frankly speaking. Absolutely. And when these facts that were, as they were portrayed in the media, proved to be wrong, like it was, for instance, this blowing of a Nord Stream pipeline. You know, first Russia was accused, then it became clear that it was United States, Ukrainians, whoever, but not Russians, you know.
Tucker Carlson asked Vladimir Putin, who did it? He said, well, you did.
Yeah. Then there was absolute silence, you know, absolute silence, yeah. And certainly we are also very much disappointed by the way that the media portray life in Russia, you know. They always are telling about the suffering of the Russian people, of some problems with the economy, of etc. I can tell you that Russians are living very decent lives. Yeah, the economy is growing. The level of social security is high, and I would say that in certain aspects it's much higher than here in the European Union. So people do not suffer at all, you know, but you'll never read about it in the newspapers here. Yeah, it's just a kind of a blackout as far as our achievements are concerned. But at the same time, I was very much encouraged because after my arrival here, I received a lot of messages, email messages from the ordinary Dutch citizens who just expressed their solidarity, their support. Yeah, and we must admit that perhaps what the mainstream media and the officials are saying do not fully represent the public opinion here in the Netherlands.
Well, what's your take on the public? I mean, driving up here, I see these Ukrainian flags in front of your door, on your doorstep.
Yeah.
So what is the public opinion in the Netherlands then, in your assessment?
You know, these Ukrainian flags, they are here for already 2 years, and we are get used to it. We do not pay attention. It's a kind of political demonstration organized by a certain organization. I don't know exactly what organization, but people who are staying just and guarding these flags, they are probably being paid by a certain organization.
Okay, we started with Peter the Great, looking at your career as the representative of the Russian Federation. Your website says you've been working in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the USSR, Russia, since 1979. It's a career of 45 years in diplomacy.
Yes.
Well, I was 9 years old at the time. So and held various leading diplomatic posts in the central office of the ministry and abroad. Why and when did our relationship deteriorate? I mean, we started with Peter the Great and all was good, and things have changed.
Yeah, you know, yes, it's a very sad phenomenon that our relations are deteriorated to that low level, perhaps the lowest in history. Just only a few years ago, the Netherlands was the biggest Russian trade partner in Europe, you know, and the relations in trade and economy were flourishing. Now they are, as I have already said, dropped down drastically. That's not our choice, that's not our decision, that's just the approach of the Dutch authorities. And we've put, frankly speaking, the full blame on the deterioration of the relations on the Dutch side, because we didn't do anything just to provoke it. But it started even before 2022. I think with the arrival of Prime Minister Rutte to power, somehow the relations began to worsen, I would say. But they reached the lowest level in 2022 when the special military operation in Ukraine started, and the Netherlands took the side of Ukraine absolutely just without any attempts to try to understand the real situation, the real just background of this conflict. They just declared that they would support Ukraine in all aspects, and really the financial support of the Netherlands to Ukraine is, as far as I know, is 3.75 billion euros. It's quite a lot. It's just the money that can be used for some social needs here in the Netherlands. And also the Netherlands, the territory of the Netherlands became the stronghold of pseudo-legal institutions like this register of damage for Ukraine, like this Center for Prosecution of the crime of aggression, etc., etc., etc. They are absolutely not legal, because from the point of view of international law, these are just institutions created only to wage, as we call it, legal aggression against Russia. Okay. And that's a very sad point. That's a very sad situation, and frankly speaking, we don't see any prospects for the improvement of our relations.
That would be the core of my interviews, and I will take that to when we are approaching the end of that. So how do we get out of this mess? Let's save that question for the end.
Okay.
There has to be a way forward, and I want to learn from you. That's one of the reasons that I invited you. Is how does Russia envision a way out of the situation that we're in? Because there must be hope somewhere. But you triggered me saying, when Mark Rutte came to power in the Netherlands some 14 years ago, that's when our relationship started to deteriorate. Did you mean causality or correlation?
Well, I don't know, but I must admit that perhaps after 2013, 2014, the relations started to deteriorate. Yes, certainly there was at that time a lot of dialogue, a lot of political exchange, a lot of trade links, but just the best time for the relations was already over. Yeah. I
was caught up in a political debate, which I didn't see coming, over our last elections and I was sitting across the table from a person of the leading party in the Netherlands at the time, Mark Rutte's party, the VVD. And the lady said, well, look at the Ukraine war, and it started in 22 with the special military operation, as you call it. I said, no. It started as some kind of a trade war, with trade agreements made by Ukraine and Russia and by Ukraine and the EU overplayed their hand. Ukraine chose for Russia as the bigger trading partner. That's where it got out of hand. If I were to ask people on the street in Russia, in Moscow, where would you say it all started, and where would they say this conflict started?
Yes, it's a wrong, I would say, it's a wrong interpretation that the conflict started in 2022. In fact, the conflict started much earlier, perhaps in 2014, when there is a coup d'etat in Ukraine, when the legitimate president, no matter someone likes him or not, but he was a legitimate president. He was ousted from the post, and when the very, very, I would say, aggressive nationalist, anti-Russian circles came to power, and then they started this so-called anti-terrorist operation in Donetsk and Lugansk, that lasted 8 years before the start of the military operation, and it was very cruel, very brutal, and a lot of civilians died. No one cares about them, you know. It's just the so-called anti-terrorist operation in Donetsk and Lugansk from 2014 until 2022 took away lives of more than 8,000 civilians, innocent people. You know, they were just killed by the Ukrainian forces, but no one cared about them. No one cared, you know. And this is just the situation that we face now. It's a consequence, first of all, of absolutely illegal coup d'etat in 2014. And when Ukraine was forced to make a choice between Russia and the West. And regrettably, the choice was taken not only to be Western oriented, but to become a kind of an anti-Russia, to deny everything that is connected with its historic ties. Ukraine was always part of Russia. And I would even say that Russians and Ukrainians, it's more or less the same people. It's one people. Okay. But with this stance, very anti-Russian, aggressive stance, and certainly the suppression of the Russian language, the suppression of the Russian culture, the plans to become a military stronghold of NATO, that certainly was one of the causes, one of the reasons that we were forced to start our military operation.
I want to move into some different topics as well, but what I would urge people to do, looking at this interview and going, well, coup d'etat, well, you should ask those questions, Rico. I interviewed a professor of international law, Alfred de Zayas, a number of times. He uses those words, and he says it was provoked. The NATO poked Russia to the point where I believe President Putin also said, they gave us no other choice in that time in 2022. I feel, so I have to pose this as a question. So the initiative at that time was with the Western parties, with NATO, and you were provoked. Where's the initiative today, then, in your assessment?
I would also like to make one point just pertaining to that period before the 2022. Yes, in 2015, I think, there were so-called Minsk agreements, just signed by Ukraine, Russia, and endorsed by France and Germany. And if they were implemented, we would have seen now a quite different picture. We would probably see a peaceful, Ukraine living within its previous borders, and if the population of Donbass and Lugansk were given what they wanted, guarantees of their cultural autonomy, first of all, of the right to feel Russians, to speak Russian, then the situation would be different. But it was very cynically admitted then by Angela Merkel and by former President of France, Holland. We never intended to fulfill these agreements, It was only a time-gaining exercise, just to gain time and to use this time to build the military forces of Ukraine, to strengthen their capacity to fight with Russia.
If we extend on that example of the Minsk agreements that were not signed in good faith, as we learned now through Angela Merkel and François Hollande, who went public about this. They're not making this up. I read that as well. But back in the day, Baker promised Gorbachev that NATO would not expand eastward.
Yeah.
So the not committing to agreements has a track record. Yeah. I'm sorry to say. How can you trust the next one? What are you going to do differently if we end up at the negotiating table eventually?
Well, I can tell you frankly that our trust in the West, promises in the West, goodwill, our trust is certainly is undermined, yeah, to a big extent. But all conflicts are to be settled by political means, and we certainly share this approach. And we put forward a number of initiatives. Our president put forward a peace plan, so to say, that if is taken as a basis for the settlement, then I believe we have good prospects for the future.
Yeah, I have to, now I'm talking to you, so I have to ask this. So if the conflict 2022 was provoked, and Jens Stoltenberg said, the former head of NATO, they want less NATO on their borders, well, I have a surprise for them, I'm going to give them more NATO on their borders. You were provoked. Currently we're in a time frame where things escalate again, with President Biden approving the use of rockets on Russian territory, and Zelensky asking for the Patriot rockets that go thousands of miles.
Yeah.
So you're being provoked again.
Yeah, yes. You know, when, for instance, when our president on the 14th of June, I think, just outlined the possible solution of the conflict, and that was rather clear solution. You know, that's the neutral, non-aligned status of Ukraine, recognition of the territorial realities as enshrined in the Russian constitution, demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. That is very important because Nazism is now flourishing. And prospects and just also certainly safeguarding the rights of the Russian population, the Russian language, and it was very clear. What was just the reaction? The reaction was the invasion in the Kursk region of Russia. Yeah, so, and then, yes, this, when the West allowed Ukraine to use long-range missiles on the Russian territory. And here we must be clear, you know, the Ukrainians, they are not capable to operate these missiles only by themselves without the direct participation of Western experts, of military advisors. Because you cannot just launch a rocket, you should have just adequate intelligence, reconnaissance specialists, trajectory should be somehow established, you know. And we all know that NATO specialists are participating in it. They are helping, they're not only helping, they are participating. And wherever or whenever there is an attack, for instance, of long-range missiles, first what we see first? We see a NATO reconnaissance plane, that is just airplane that is moving somewhere just in this area. So, and yes, yesterday we I would not say retaliated. No, that was a kind of a just warning. We used our medium-range rocket, medium-range missile, Oreshnikas, they called it, translated from Russia, it's hazelnut. Yeah, that was a kind of a test and demonstration, because it hit the military plant, actually just a military plant in Dnipropetrovsk. in Ukraine, but it was only kind of a test, and our president stressed it because this is very powerful rocket. It didn't have the warheads, real warheads.
Well, you say this with pride. I want to move into the question on that. But these things are not just powerful; they're very fast.
Yeah.
So they're hypersonic weapons, and there's no defense against them. And Russia just started to deploy that.
Yeah.
So
we haven't deployed them, as far as I know, on our just western borders. No, it was just a test, and it was not us, but it was the United States who left this treaty on intermediate and short-range missiles that banned this deployment of this kind of weapons. So that was a test and a demonstration and a warning. That was not an attempt to intimidate anyone. No. But since this is a very dangerous escalation demonstrated by the NATO countries when they allowed Ukrainians to use long-range missiles against our territory, that was a kind of just demonstration what can be the possible response to it. Yeah, that's it. Nothing more.
I'm going to ask it anyway. So you must be assessing what's the motives here. So what are NATO's motives? What are the West's motives?
They do not even conceal it. They are saying quite clearly that they want to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia. That wanted Russia to be defeated, to be put on its knees. And most attractive, I think, scenario for is Russia to be disintegrated. Yeah. And but that's not possible. That's not possible. And these plans, these scenarios, they only give way to further escalation. That is very dangerous because they, regrettably, I hate to say this, but the perspective of the nuclear war is closer than it used to be just a couple of years ago, and even when there was a kind of a real dialogue on security issues between Russia and NATO. Yeah, NATO. It was initially envisaged as an answer, as a kind of a response of the Western countries to the creation of the Soviet bloc, to the creation of
the Warsaw Pact was created after Germany joined NATO. So
yes. But initially, yes, they were preparing to fight with the Soviet Union and with its allies in Eastern Europe. But now there is no Soviet Union. There is no allies of Russia in Eastern Europe, only enemies. Yeah, certainly Belarus is our friend and our ally, but the former members of the Warsaw Pact, they are very hostile. Yeah. So there is no need of NATO to exist now, absolutely. There is no military purpose. The only military purpose is just to attack Russia and to destroy Russia.
Well, there you go. You need an enemy to give yourself purpose.
Yes. So they are creating an enemy, Yeah. They are just making an enemy out of Russia, out of all our just moves. They all see it as a kind of a preparation for war that is absolutely not correct. Our president several times stressed, and I don't think this is just declaration. This is his real position that we do not want to attack anyone. The Baltic states, they are saying, okay, we will be the next. No, we don't need just let them live as they are living.
I believe you have more allies than just what you just mentioned. And I will move into questions on BRICS, for instance, and the United Nations reform, because the world is bigger than the Russia-Ukraine border. But before that, just one other question that I had. I'm talking to you now, but what journalistic interest, like this interview, do you receive, or do your colleagues, ambassadors in other countries, receive currently?
Yes, if we take certainly the countries of the south, of the global south, of BRICS states, then there is a huge journalistic interest, and our ambassadors address frequently the local media in a very, I would say, open and friendly manner, in a spirit of just a mutual understanding, I would say, and mutual respect. The situation in the Western countries is different, though my colleagues in other European countries, they're sometimes approached by the local media, for instance, in Britain, in Italy, in some other countries. Here in the Netherlands, regrettably, that is not the case. But if we are approached, it's a kind of questions, just that are not really.
This is when the diplomat kicks in.
Yes,
what kind of questions? I saw the interview in Buitenhof a couple of years ago.
Yes, my predecessor gave just a number of interviews that were somehow first. Yes, this Buitenhof, the attitude of the journalist was very hostile.
Exactly.
Yeah. Then he gave one more interview, and it was when it appeared, it was so distorted, somehow just that you'll never recognize it, and that's certainly very, very frustrating and very, I would say, disappointing. Yeah. We were also just sometimes we are asked by the local media, they ask us questions, but these are always some kind of questions aiming at distort our just position, our attitude, or to point out to some minor and not very, I would say, relevant issues. And that's why I am very grateful to you for this opportunity to address the Dutch public that I really respect directly, and hopefully I will be heard.
Yeah, I hope so too. But okay. Well, you mentioned your colleague in London. The Russian ambassador,
Ambassador Kellen, yes.
Who's very outspoken or very verbal.
Yeah.
I urge people to, if you use Telegram, he's got a channel there. For me, it's frustrating to not be able to read Russian media here. It's been cut off, it's been censored. So what's my source of information then? What do these Russians think? What do they? So your colleague in London, the compliments for him.
Yes. Certainly, we're having just our Telegram channel we have it here in the Netherlands. Our embassy is using it, but we have certainly our channel is in Russian because it mainly aimed at Russian of our compatriots living here. Yeah. But for instance, the Telegram channel of the Foreign Ministry has its English version.
Exactly.
And that's I think very instructive and very informative. So I advise everybody to have a look at it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So just recently, your colleague in London was interviewed by BBC Hard Talk. I saw that also, but that was not much unlike. I mean, the British allow you to finish your sentences, so that was different from what happened here in the Netherlands. But that was hostile also.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, let's move into some other questions that I prepared for you. The United Nations tweeted on September 2023, news. The Pact for the Future has been adopted by member countries by consensus at UN headquarters in New York. The adoption will help pave the way for greater international cooperation for our common future. Now, some 20 years ago, you were the senior counselor and legal advisor to the permanent mission of the Russian Federation of the United Nations. You were one of the people on behalf of Russia working at the United Nations.
Yeah.
So you've been there.
Yeah.
You've been yeah. Now, Russian press agency TASS said on October 3rd, Russian President Vladimir Putin said Moscow backs the idea of UN reform and its adaptation to the modern day demands, but these should be quality changes. My interpretation of all this is the UN wants to reform, but Russia says, well, no, we need to reform, but slightly differently. What's the position of Russia on the functioning of United Nations?
No, I think our position is very clear. First of all, we fully recognize that the United Nations was established 80 years ago, and since then a lot of changes happened, and the world is different from that it was in 1945. And so the United Nations should adapt to these changes. But one thing I would like to make clear, we do not believe that the United Nations Charter is obsolete. No. You know, it is a treaty that can fully reflect all the changes, all the needs, all the concerns of the world community, and it can, if just implemented, it can guarantee the international peace and security. But one thing is very important: there should not be a selective approach to the United Nations Charter. You know, just one striking example. For instance, this principle of self-determination of peoples, you know. When it was applied to Kosovo, yes, the Western countries fully supported Kosovo's independence, in spite of the fact that there was never a kind of a referendum there, or just no one asked the population of Kosovo whether they wanted to be just independent or not. But they applauded. When it comes, for instance, to Crimea, when there was a referendum, when the absolute majority of the population pronounced for the unification with Russia, no, it was rejected, absolutely no. So it's just a kind of, you know, just selective approach and double standards. That should be avoided. But then the second, certainly, issue that is interesting to everyone is the expansion of the Security Council. Yes, the Security Council perhaps needs to be expanded. Its membership, and certainly Global South is to be represented in the capacity of permanent members. That's why we fully support the desire of, for instance, India and Brazil to be permanent members of the Security Council. At the same time, and certainly Africa is to be also represented, by all means. But at the same time, we believe that the representation of the Western countries is quite sufficient now. And there are six out of 15 Western countries that are always in the Security Council. That's why we do not believe that any addition is necessary and feasible. For instance, and I know that Germany just wants to be permanent members. We do not believe it's feasible, or Japan, for instance, because they do not speak their sovereign voice. They speak just kind of a voice of the United West.
So the conflict being played out in real life in Ukraine is also being played out in who gets to be on the Security Council. Are you pro-Western or are you pro something else? That's okay. You mentioned India and Brazil. Well, should not be a surprise that they are member to BRICS. Well, let's move into that also. There was a BRICS summit in Kazan last month, on which Russian President Vladimir Putin led the final session advocating for reforms at the UN. Now, that three-day event in Kazan focused on enhancing financial collaboration, including the creation of alternatives to payment system dominated by the West, addressing regional conflicts, and plans to expand the BRICS memberships. So could you elaborate, could you tell me or the audience what is BRICS and what does it hope to achieve?
Well, yes, really, BRICS is now very, very fast-growing, I would say, alliance, fast-growing group. It's not an organization, it's a kind of a group of states. But why it is so attractive to quite a number of countries? Because first of all, it's perhaps the only group with world significance that is not dominated by the Western countries. And the second issue is that BRICS is composed on the basis of just search for common approaches. It is based on the principle of balance of interest. No one tries to impose, just its will on others. There is no group discipline. We all know that the European Union just speaks one voice. You cannot speak other. Just you cannot have other positions than the position of the rest of the countries. When Hungary tries, for instance, yes, it being just blamed just that's the situation, and BRICS is attractive because yes, it is a free alliance. It is composed on the balance of interest, on the respect for the position of each other. And now we have 10 states. There were 5. Now 5 more joined it. And there are about 20 or even more states that are aspiring to join it. And the summit in Kazan was very successful. And I believe that we have just 3 pillars that BRICS is concentrating its attention on. It's first of all policy and security, then economy and finance, and second, humanitarian ties and cultural exchanges. And one of the most important in the sphere of economy, of finance, yes, is just to try to build economic exchanges with the help of national currencies, to try to get away from dollar or euro that is being used as political tools, and to try to develop its only interbank system of exchanges, to promote trade, to promote financial cooperation in different fields. And certainly one of the most important issues are cultural exchanges, sport exchanges, because sport is also now very politicized. But in BRICS, it is not politicized, it's just real sports, So
we're going to get BRICS tournaments?
There are already.
I have no idea.
Yeah, there were BRICS games.
Oh, okay.
This summer there were BRICS games in Kazan. They were very, very successful.
So what does it aspire to solve? I mean, I hear you well.
Yeah.
The dollar's being weaponized, euros being weaponized, payment systems are being weaponized. So it's an alternative to those systems. Sports also?
Yes, regrettably, we all see it.
You're not allowed to participate in some events.
Yes, Russia is banned from all world tournaments. Yes, and the same is the situation with some other countries. So sports is used as a political tool, yes, also, and this is very regrettable. It's contrary to the very idea of sports competitions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but only, I have no idea, I didn't prepare for this, but only BRICS countries get to compete in the BRICS games then?
No, I think they were open for other countries, just willing. I don't, frankly speaking, I don't know how many countries participated in these games, but surely, all BRICS countries and all countries that are just aspiring to
compete in sports.
Yes.
Okay, sounds nice. Let's if we go back to United Nations and United Nations Charter, and again I urge people, and I'll list it under this interview, to hear what Alfred de Zayas said on the matter. Like United Nations. We had the League of Nations that failed, and then we started United Nations. But what it is in the name. It's a group of nations. They claim to be for the people, but that's not the membership. The nations, it's nation states that make up United Nations. And the right to self-determination is not a right of nations, it's a right of people. So there's a conflict of interest there. And de Zayas said, well, look in the charter, look in the agreements that we made. Self-determination is root of all our agreements. So that's...
I think all the United Nations principles and rules, they must be somehow seen together. One should not try to distinguish only one rule, to ignore others. Yes, rule of self-determination is extremely important, but at the same time, the sovereign equality of all states in the United Nations. These are principles that should be seen together,
You see the United Nations exist in 10 years from now?
Yes, I do.
I mean, League of Nations did fail. I didn't mention it.
No, I do. United Nations is, frankly speaking, is doing quite a lot of useful things, Yes, there is now the politicization everywhere, and this should be avoided. Even in the sphere of culture, if you take, for instance, UNESCO, it's also politicized, and even some very specific professional technical organizations like the OPCW that we have now here in The Hague, it is extremely politicized.
Yeah, our time is limited here, and we have covered already so many topics. But I would love to continue this conversation maybe some other time on the OPCW.
Yes, I am absolutely ready to discuss the...
I know, you're the permanent representative.
Since I am a permanent representative in the OPCW, it's a challenging task now. But yes, this organization also going through a very difficult period of time.
Okay. Well, so let's not move into that right now. But there are some bodies in the United Nations, or part of that family of bodies that are privately funded. And I'm not going to move into that also, but just to pose that, World Health Organization, privately funded. Bill Gates is one of the main sponsors. That's United Nations also.
Yes, there are, I would not say privately funded, it's just voluntary contributions.
That's the diplomat, okay. But
yes, that's certainly one of the issues that where a good balance is to be found. United Nations cannot operate only on the basis of this payments from state parties. That's not enough.
Right.
So when voluntary contributions are feasible, yes, they are welcome. When voluntary contributions are not intended, I would say, to exert certain political pressure or to determine the position of the organization, they are welcome. They are welcome. Yeah. We pay quite a lot of voluntary contributions to different United Nations organs, and we finance some projects, but certainly a good balance is to be found.
Just to close up, again, I will list this also, but the previous rapporteur on torture and other cruel and inhumane behavior, Mr. Niels Meltzer, I interviewed him, and he said all my voluntary donations were cancelled when I took up the case of Julian Assange. So there's risk in that.
That's the case, because some states there is certainly a temptation to use its voluntary contribution as a means to influence the position. Yes, it's. I don't think it's. One could argue with it, but that should be avoided. That should be avoided.
If we go back to where we started, the conflict in Ukraine, without my personal opinion, that's not of relevance here. I want to learn the Russian position. How is it to be resolved? By whom and when? How would you have it move into a future?
Well, now there are certainly different approaches to the way to resolve the conflict. First of all, I must stress that we are not against political settlement. No, we do not exclude it. We certainly recognize that all the conflicts are to be ended by a political, negotiated solution. But there are very different approaches now, I would say. Certainly we have this Zelensky peace plan that is absolutely not relevant and is not realistic, and I don't even want to discuss it, just to comment on it now. We have, as I have already mentioned, a proposal of President Putin put forward on the 14th of June, and I enumerated already just its basic components. Yeah, we have plans of China and India that we believe could be a basis of the solution, And I want to remind you that in March 2022, just immediately after the start, soon after the start of the conflict, there were already peace talks between Russia and Ukraine in Istanbul. And the possible agreement was more or less initialed, by the states. And Ukrainians want some guarantees of for their security. We were prepared to give these guarantees, to discuss that. Yeah, and certainly we were very insistent on the recognition of Crimea as a part of Russia, and the guarantees for the Russian population. So they were more or less agreed. But then United Kingdom interfered, and Mr. Boris Johnson, who was at that time Prime Minister, he just told the Ukrainians, no, stop negotiating, go on fighting. And regrettably, what we see now from the Western countries is a desire to continue this conflict in spite of all these nice words, We see that we see who is the main beneficiary of the conflict. It's military-industrial complex and the United States who they are the main beneficiary of the conflict.
People selling the guns, yeah.
Yeah, so they don't want to stop it. And that's why they proclaim this fight against the very last Ukrainian. Yeah, Ukrainian and Russians are paying for it. And I believe that if there is a genuine will to find a solution that is acceptable to everybody, then perhaps there will be.
I spoke to a number of people who have their hopes on Donald Trump fixing the problem in a day. I do not believe he's been congratulated just yet, but maybe relationships with the United States don't call for that just yet. But how are you hopeful? Is that going to be fixed January 21st, you think?
No, that's not possible. No, that's just kind of just declarations that do not have anything with reality. The situation is very difficult, I would say, and very complex, and so it cannot be settled just like this in one day by a telephone call. No. But if the United States somehow take a more realistic approach to the situation, if they stop, pumping Ukraine with armaments that do not change the situation drastically, they only prolong the conflict, If they somehow advise Zelensky to be more realistic, then perhaps the solution could be found. Yes, as I said, the United States is the main beneficiary, and in general, we must say that Ukrainian authorities, they are not, I would say, somehow sovereign in their decisions. They are under the control of NATO, of United States. So if the West is taking a more, I would say, realistic approach, then why not?
Mr. Vladimir Tarabrin, thank you for this frank conversation. I'm no diplomat, but I would hope we'd send diplomats to fix this rather than bombs. So I would agree with you there.
Yeah, thank you.
Any closing statements you would like to make to the Dutch audience or the audience in general, now that you're on camera here,
well,
uncensored?
Yes, I would say that it's a privilege and honor for me to address the Dutch audience, and since I'm ambassador here, one of my main tasks is to make my country, I would say, more clear, the policy of my country, the moves of Russia, to make them more clear and understandable to the local public. That's what I'm trying to do. Yes, I am practically deprived of the possibility to address the mainstream media. And our dialogue with the Dutch authorities, with the Dutch officials, is now also very limited. We don't have just kind of frank exchange of views on world issues, on the political situation. When I meet officials, Dutch officials, it's usually exchange of just prepared statements according to some probably methodical guidelines. It's very regrettable.
Thank you for this conversation.
Thank you.
Het gaat hier vandaag over saamhorigheid.
We zien dingen niet normaal maken wat niet normaal.
Every nation
hebben allebei
in
wel
every region
gelijk.
now has a decision
Als
to
we
make.
verder willen en ik gewoon van
You think
je
I'm joking?
land bekijk.
Predator
Als
drones.
ik daar zie wat jij ziet,
You will never see it coming.
respect is waar het begint. Als we
Laat staan dat ik
kunnen
kan ingaan over vuur.
wat sterker is, wint.